Pull the plug Friday. We're done wasting resources. Dr. Victor Halpern slammed the chart shut so hard the metal clipboard rang against the doorframe. He didn't look at the young man on the bed. Not once. He grabbed his pen, pressed it down, and signed the death order in one single stroke, the way you sign a parking ticket. Then he turned to the team behind him and said it loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. Pull the plug Friday. We're done wasting resources. He was already walking away before the words finished landing. Behind him, a machine beeped. A finger moved, and a nurse named Olivia Bennett went completely still because she had just watched a doctor sentence a conscious man to death. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened in that hospital room is something that will stay with you for a long time. The morning shift at Walter Reed Veterans Medical Center started the same way it always did, with the smell of antiseptic in the hallways, the low hum of ventilators, and the sound of rubber-soled shoes squeaking against freshly mopped floors. Nurses moved quickly, doctors moved faster. Nobody stopped unless they had to. That was the rhythm of the place. DFF, clinical, relentless. Olivia Bennett had only been working there for 11 days. She was 31 years old, and she had requested the neurology ward specifically, not because it was prestigious and not because it was easy. She requested it because she had seen too many patients in her life get lost inside systems that stopped paying attention to them. She had spent 3 years as a combat medic, embedded with special operations units in eastern Afghanistan. And in that time, she had learned one thing above everything else. The body tells you things that the machines will miss. You just have to be willing to listen. Room 114 was at the far end of the corridor, and Ethan Carter's file had been handed to her on her very first day. She had read it twice before she ever walked through his door. Ethan Carter, 24 years old, Navy SEAL trainee, Class 342. 4 months earlier, during an underwater combat diving exercise off the coast of Virginia Beach, something had gone wrong. The exact sequence of events was still being reviewed by the Naval Safety Center, but the result was undeniable. Ethan had been pulled from the water unconscious. He had been deprived of oxygen for somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes. By the time the medical team reached him on the boat, his heart had stopped. They brought him back. But whatever version of Ethan they brought back, the neurologists at Walter Reed had spent 4 months trying to determine how much of him was still there. Their conclusion, according to the file, very little. The official diagnosis was persistent vegetative state. The language in the medical report was precise and careful, the way medical language always is when it is delivering a sentence. No meaningful cortical response to stimuli, no purposeful motor activity, no evidence of awareness of self or environment. There were pages of EEG readouts attached to the file. There were consultation notes from 3 different neurologists. There was a recommendation, signed and dated, that a family conference be scheduled to discuss transition to comfort care, which was the hospital's way of saying it was time to talk about removing life support. Olivia read all of it. Then she walked into room 114 and introduced herself to Ethan Carter. She had done this her entire career, introduced herself to patients who couldn't respond because she believed somewhere, on some level, they could hear. She stood at the side of his bed and said, "Hi, Ethan. My name is Olivia. I'm your nurse, and I'm going to be coming in here every day. I just wanted you to know that." She watched his face. Nothing moved. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm. His eyes were closed. His hands rested at his sides, completely still. She stayed for 4 more minutes, just watching, just listening to the sounds his body made. Then she left. But she came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By day 4, she had started keeping her own informal notes, not in the official chart, but in a small spiral notebook she carried in the left pocket of her scrubs. She wrote down the time of each visit and what she observed: heart rate, respiratory rate, any physical variation she noticed. She wrote down whether the room had been noisy or quiet when she arrived. She noted whether the lights were bright or dim. She noted whether anyone else had been in the room recently. On day 5, she wrote, HR elevated approximately 8 beats per minute when I entered and spoke. Returned to baseline when I left. Coincidence? On day 7, she wrote, breathing pattern changed when I said his name. Slight increase in rate, then brief pause. Checking tomorrow. On day 8, she wrote, eyelids, left lid, slight tremor when I called his name twice in a row. Not a blink, more like a flutter. Not listed in any previous nursing notes. On day 9, she wrote, his right index finger. I was adjusting the blanket and I watched his right index finger move, slow, toward the left, then stopped. I stood absolutely still for 6 minutes afterward. It did not happen again. On day 10, she wrote, the finger moved again, same hand, same direction. I had just said his name. On day 11, which was the morning Dr. Halpern signed the final assessment form, Olivia Bennett was standing in the corner of room 114 when the doctor walked in. She had been hoping to speak with him. She had her notebook in her hand. Dr. Victor Halpern was 62 years old and had been chief of neurology at Walter Reed for 9 years. Before that, he had spent 11 years at Massachusetts General, where he had trained under 2 of the most decorated neurologists in the country. He was not a cruel man, exactly, but he was the kind of man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that certainty was more valuable than doubt. He had seen too many families devastated by false hope. He had watched too many colleagues drag patients through painful interventions that accomplished nothing. He believed his job was to be honest, even when honest was brutal. Especially then. He walked into room 114 at 7:43 in the morning. He did not look at Olivia. He pulled the chart from the door slot, flipped to the back page, and began reading. Olivia said, "Good morning, Dr. Halpern. I've been observing some things with Mr. Carter that I'd like to discuss with you." He did not look up. "Go ahead." His heart rate elevates when someone enters the room and speaks to him. His breathing pattern changes when I call his name. And I've observed deliberate finger movement twice, both times following auditory stimulation. Halpern flipped a page in the chart. Documented? In my personal notes, yes. I was going to transfer them to the official chart today. Are they in the official chart right now? No, sir. He looked up at her then, for the first time. His expression wasn't angry. It was patient. The way a professor is patient with a student who keeps misreading the same equation. Nurse Bennett, is it? You've been here how long? 11 days. 11 days. He closed the chart. I have 237 peer-reviewed publications. I have trained 46 neurologists who are now practicing across this country. I have evaluated more than 3,000 patients with disorders of consciousness over the course of my career. And 3 separate neurologists, 3, have confirmed this diagnosis over the last 4 months. He picked up his pen. Reflex movements in vegetative patients are normal. They don't indicate awareness. They are produced by the brainstem, not the cortex. That is first-year medical school material. He uncapped the pen. I'll note your concerns in the chart. And then he signed his name. And then he walked out. Olivia stood in the room for a long moment after he left. She looked at Ethan's face. She looked at his hand. She looked at the monitors above his bed, the EEG display, the cardiac monitor, the ventilator readout. Then she looked more carefully at the EEG display. She was not a neurologist. She had not been trained to read EEG output at an advanced clinical level. But she had spent enough time in trauma environments to understand the basics. And something about the EEG readings for Ethan Carter had bothered her since the first day she had looked at them. She had been trying to figure out what it was. Now, standing in the quiet of the room, She finally let herself look at it carefully, without rushing. The sensors. There were 19 standard electrodes in a full clinical EEG setup, positioned across the scalp according to a precise international map. She counted the sensors on Ethan's head, then she counted them again. 17. 2 of the sensors had been repositioned. She could see faint marks on his scalp where the original placements had been. Someone had moved them, shifted them away from the temporal and parietal regions, the areas of the brain most associated with awareness and conscious processing. She opened her notebook and wrote, EEG sensors, check placement history, who moved them, when. Then she went to the nurse's station and pulled up the electronic medical record on the computer terminal. She scrolled back through the treatment history, 4 months of notes, medication logs, procedure entries. She was looking for any record of a sensor repositioning. She found one note, entered 6 weeks ago by a technician. It said only, EEG leads adjusted for patient comfort. She sat back in her chair. Patient comfort. For a patient who, according to the official diagnosis, had no awareness of discomfort. She went back further in the medication log and stopped cold. 3 weeks ago, Ethan's dosage of lorazepam, a benzodiazepine sedative, had been increased by 40%. There was no note in the chart explaining why, no physician order attached. She scrolled through every entry around that date, searching for a clinical reason. There was nothing. No new symptoms, no agitation noted, no seizure activity, no documented reason at all. She sat very still at that terminal for a full minute. Lorazepam was a powerful central nervous system depressant. In high enough doses, it could suppress voluntary movement so completely that a conscious patient might be unable to produce any detectable physical response to stimulation. In other words, if Ethan Carter was fighting to move, to signal, to communicate, that medication could be burying every effort he made. It could be rendering his body mute. And if his body was mute when the neurologists examined him, their findings would reflect not his true state, but the state of medicated suppression. She closed the computer terminal. She sat for another full minute thinking about what the right thing to do was. She was 11 days into a new job. She had no allies in this hospital yet. She had no authority. She had a spiral notebook full of personal observations and a suspicion about medication and sensors that she could not yet prove, and that one of the most decorated neurologists in the country had already waved away without looking up from the chart. She thought about what a reasonable person in her position would do. A reasonable person would document everything carefully. A reasonable person would file a formal concern through the appropriate hospital channels. A reasonable person would wait for the process to work. She knew all of that. She also knew that Ethan Carter was scheduled to have his life support withdrawn within 72 hours. She picked up her phone. It took her 40 minutes to find the right number. She went through the Naval Hospital Patient Liaison Office first, then through the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, then through a duty officer who told her firmly that Admiral Carter was not available for personal calls during operational hours, and that she should leave a message with the family liaison coordinator. She said, very calmly, "I understand. Please tell Admiral Carter that a nurse at Walter Reed named Olivia Bennett called. Please tell him the message is about his son, and please tell him it's urgent." She hung up and went back to room 114. She sat down in the chair beside Ethan's bed. She reached over and placed her hand gently on top of his, not pressing, not applying any technique, just resting her hand there the way she had learned to do in Afghanistan, when a wounded soldier needed to know that someone was present with him. She said quietly, "I hear you, Ethan. I don't know if you can hear me back, but I hear you, and I'm not going anywhere." His heart rate, on the monitor above the bed, rose by 9 beats per minute. She didn't look up at it. She already knew. The call came back to her at 6:17 that evening. She was in the break room eating a sandwich she had stopped tasting 30 minutes earlier when her phone buzzed. The caller ID said, "Unknown." She answered immediately. The voice on the other end was measured, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent decades keeping his emotions on the inside of his chest, because that was what his career required of him. But underneath the control, she could hear something tight and terrified that he was trying very hard not to let out. "This is Admiral Robert Carter. I was told you called about my son." "Yes, sir," she said. She had rehearsed what she was going to say. She threw the rehearsal out. "Sir, I'm a nurse on the neurology ward at Walter Reed. I've been assigned to your son's care. I have to be honest with you. I don't have the authority to tell you what I'm about to tell you. I could lose my job over this call. But I believe your son's diagnosis may be wrong. And I believe you need to know that before it's too late to do anything about it." There was a silence on the line that lasted approximately 4 seconds. "Tell me everything," the Admiral said. She told him about the finger movement. She told him about the heart rate changes and the breathing patterns. She told him about the EEG sensors that had been moved away from the most diagnostically relevant regions of his son's scalp. She told him about the lorazepam increase, the 40% dosage jump with no documented clinical reason, timed precisely in the weeks before evaluations. She said it all plainly, without drama, the way she had learned to deliver information under pressure, with clarity, because clarity was what kept people alive. When she finished, there was another silence. "Are you telling me," Admiral Carter said slowly, "that my son might be conscious, that he might be aware, and that someone increased his sedation before they examined him? I'm telling you that the evidence I've observed raises serious questions about the accuracy of his diagnosis. I'm telling you that there are irregularities in his treatment record that I cannot explain. And I'm telling you that there is a technique, a method I learned from combat medics in a special operations environment that I believe could help us determine, right now, whether Ethan is still in there. But I can't use it without authorization. And I can't get authorization through normal channels in time." Another silence. "I'll be there at 0500 tomorrow," Admiral Carter said. The line went dead. Olivia sat in the break room for a long time after the call ended. She looked at her hands. They were steady. That surprised her slightly. She had just done something that could end her nursing career. She had gone around the entire chain of command, hospital administration, patient services, every layer of institutional protocol that was supposed to stand between a new nurse and a family member of a critical patient. She had called a 3-star admiral directly and told him the hospital might be making a catastrophic error in the management of his son's care. If she was wrong, if what she had observed turned out to be nothing more than reflex activity, if the EEG sensor positioning had a legitimate explanation she hadn't found yet, if the lorazepam increase had a clinical basis she had missed, then she had just devastated a grieving father with false hope, and she would be terminated, and she would deserve it. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about the finger, moving slowly, deliberately, toward the sound. She thought about the 9-beat heart rate increase when she placed her hand on top of his. She thought about 3 years in Afghanistan, standing beside men whose bodies had been broken in ways that most people would assume were unsurvivable. She thought about what she had learned in those 3 years, about the distance between what a machine measured and what a body knew. She finished her sandwich. She went back to room 114 and sat with Ethan for another hour before her shift ended. Before she left, she leaned close and spoke quietly into the space above his ear. "Your father is coming tomorrow morning. He's going to be here at 5 o'clock. I need you to hold on until then." The monitor registered nothing unusual. But in the stillness of that room, in the dim light above the bed, she watched Ethan Carter's right hand very slowly, so slowly she almost wasn't sure it was happening, shift 1 inch to the left, toward the sound of her voice. She walked out of the hospital into the cold Maryland night and stood outside the entrance for a long time, letting the cold air hit her face. She had made her call. She had taken her risk. Now all she could do was wait for morning and pray she wasn't wrong about the man lying in room 114. She had seen soldiers fight their way back from places nobody believed they could return from. She had seen the human body refuse to surrender long after everyone around it had given up. She had learned, in those 3 years in the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan, that the difference between giving up and surviving was often just one person, one single person, who refused to stop believing. She was that person now. She walked to her car. 40 miles away, in a house in Annapolis, Maryland, a 3-star admiral sat in the dark in his study for a very long time after ending the call. A photograph of his son sat on the desk in front of him. Taken the summer before the accident, Ethan in his training gear, grinning, 23 years old and untouchable, the way young men always believe themselves to be untouchable. Admiral Robert Carter put his hand flat on that photograph, and for the first time in 4 months, he let himself believe that his son might still be fighting. Admiral Robert Carter arrived at Walter Reed at 4:58 in the morning. Not 5 o'clock, 4:58, because in 31 years of naval service, he had never once been late to anything that mattered. And this was the only thing in his life that had ever mattered more than the Navy itself. He didn't go to the administrative desk. He didn't check in with the duty nurse. He walked straight to the elevator, pressed the button for the 3rd floor, and stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw set in the way that anyone who had ever served under him would have recognized immediately. The look that meant a decision had already been made, and the only remaining question was execution. Olivia was waiting for him at the elevator doors when they opened. She had been there since 4:30. She took one look at him and understood exactly who he was before he said a word. Not because of the uniform, he wasn't wearing one. He was in dark civilian clothes, a gray jacket, no insignia, nothing that announced his rank. But it was in the way he carried himself, the way the space around him seemed to compress slightly, the way his eyes scanned the corridor in less than 2 seconds and cataloged everything in it. She had spent 3 years around special operations commanders. She knew the posture. "Nurse Bennett," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir." She extended her hand. He shook it once, firmly. "Thank you for coming." "My son is at the end of this hallway," he said. "We can thank each other later. Walk with me." They moved quickly down the corridor. It was still early enough that the ward was quiet, the overnight staff winding down their shifts, the day staff not yet fully arrived. That was intentional on Olivia's part. She had timed this carefully. "Before we go in," she said, keeping her voice low, "I need to tell you what I'm planning to do, and why. And I need you to understand something important. What I'm about to attempt is not in any standard hospital protocol. If anyone on the medical staff sees it happen and reports it, I will be suspended and possibly terminated. I need you to know that going in." The Admiral stopped walking. He turned and looked at her directly, and she held his gaze without flinching. "Do you believe my son is in there?" he asked. "Yes, sir, I do." "Then do what you have to do," he said. "I'll handle the rest." They went in. Room 114 was dim. The overnight nurse had lowered the lights around 2 in the morning, and no one had raised them since. The ventilator pulsed steadily. The monitors glowed blue-green above the bed. Ethan Carter lay exactly as he always lay, on his back, hands at his sides, chest rising and falling to the machine's rhythm, face still and pale and 24 years old. Admiral Carter stopped just inside the door. He stood there for a long moment without moving or speaking. Olivia watched him from the side. She watched him look at his son, really look at him, take in every detail, and she watched something cross his face that had no name in military vocabulary, something private and enormous. Then he said, quietly, "Hey, kid." His voice cracked once from the second word and then held. "I'm here." Nothing on the monitors changed. Olivia stepped to the bedside. She spoke in a normal, clear voice, the way she always did. "Ethan, your father is here with you. He came this morning. He's standing right next to you." She paused. "I'm going to try something now. I need you to work with me if you can." She looked at the Admiral. "Stand close. Make sure he can hear your breathing." He moved to the bedside rail without a word. Olivia placed 2 fingers, her index and middle finger, against the side of Ethan's neck, just below the jaw, along the line where the vagus nerve ran close to the surface. She applied light, precise pressure. Not painful, targeted. The vagus nerve was the longest cranial nerve in the human body, running from the brainstem all the way through the chest and abdomen, and in a combat medical context, trained medics had discovered that specific stimulation of this nerve could produce responses in patients who failed to respond to any standard neurological test. It bypassed the cortical pathways that sedatives most aggressively suppressed. It spoke directly to something older and deeper in the nervous system. She had seen it work twice in Afghanistan, both times on patients everyone else had written off. She pressed gently and counted in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The room was completely silent except for the ventilator. 6, 7, 8. The Admiral was barely breathing. She could feel the tension radiating off him from 2 feet away. 9, 10. Nothing. She pressed slightly deeper, adjusted the angle by 3 degrees, held, and then Ethan Carter's right hand rose off the bed. Not a twitch, not a spasm. The entire hand lifted, slowly with effort, like something surfacing from deep water, and turned in the direction of his father's breathing. The fingers opened. Admiral Robert Carter made a sound that Olivia had never heard a human being make before, and hoped she would never have to hear again. It was not a cry. It was something that came from a place below crying, from somewhere a person only reaches after months of carrying a weight so heavy that when it shifts even slightly, the body doesn't know how to process it. He grabbed his son's hand with both of his, and Ethan squeezed back. Not hard, not a strong grip, but it was real, and it was deliberate, and it lasted for 4 full seconds before Ethan's strength gave out and his hand relaxed. The Admiral dropped to one knee beside the bed. He pressed his son's hand against his forehead and stayed there. Olivia stepped back to give him space. She pressed herself against the far wall of the room and crossed her arms and looked at the floor and felt something shift in her chest that she hadn't allowed herself to feel through 11 days of observation and documentation and quietly terrified waiting. She had been right. She had been right. And the weight of being right in this particular situation was almost as heavy as the weight of being wrong would have been. She gave him 3 minutes. Then she said gently, "Sir, we need to move fast. The day shift starts in 40 minutes, and if Dr. Halpern comes in before we've..." "What do you need?" Admiral Carter was on his feet. His voice was completely steady again. Whatever had just crossed his face was back inside, sealed. But his eyes were different. Something had been relit in them. "I need an independent neurologist, someone outside this hospital, outside this chain of medical command, someone with enough authority that the hospital cannot ignore their findings." "I have someone," he said immediately. "Dr. Laura Kensington, Johns Hopkins. She did a residency at Bethesda Naval. I've known her for 12 years. She's one of the best in the country. Can you reach her today?" "I can reach her in the next 20 minutes. Then make the call," Olivia said, "but not from this room. And sir, one more thing. We need to document exactly what just happened. The response we got from Ethan. I need you to be willing to testify to it." The Admiral looked at her steadily. "Nurse Bennett, I have testified in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I think I can handle a hospital board." He walked out into the corridor to make the call. Olivia turned back to Ethan. His hand was resting on the blanket again. Still. The monitors showed his heart rate, elevated by 11 beats per minute above his baseline. She leaned in close and said quietly, "You did good. Stay with us. We're going to get you out of this." The heart rate held at 11 above baseline for the next 4 minutes before slowly dropping back. She documented every second of it. What happened next moved faster than she expected and slower than she needed. Dr. Halpern arrived at 7:51, 8 minutes earlier than his usual time. Olivia was at the nurse's station when she heard his voice down the corridor, and the sound of it sent her stomach into her throat. She had not yet had time to file any formal documentation of what had happened that morning. The only record was in her notebook and in the memory of a 3-star admiral who was currently on the phone in a family consultation room at the far end of the hall. She walked toward Dr. Halpern before he could reach room 114. "Dr. Halpern," she said, "I need to speak with you." He glanced at her. His expression was not warm. "I have rounds in 4 minutes. This is about Ethan Carter. I have new observations to report, significant ones." He stopped. He turned to face her fully. "Nurse Bennett, I thought we settled this yesterday." "We did not settle it," she said. The steadiness of her own voice surprised her. "I observed a deliberate motor response this morning, purposeful movement in the right hand, directed toward auditory stimulus. I also need to discuss some irregularities I found in the medication log, specifically the lorazepam dosage increase from 3 weeks ago, which has no documented clinical justification." Halpern's face changed. It was subtle. Most people would have missed it. A tightening around the eyes, a slight pause before his next breath. He covered it quickly, replacing it with the patient, condescending expression he had used on her the day before. "Motor responses in vegetative patients." "I know what you're going to say," Olivia said. "Brainstem activity, reflexes. I've heard it, but I need you to explain to me, in writing, why a sedative was increased by 40% in a vegetative patient with no documented reason, timed 3 weeks before a final evaluation was scheduled." A full second of silence. "That is a clinical decision that was made by the attending physician." "Who is you?" Olivia said. His jaw tightened. "I want that explanation in the patient's chart," she said. "Documented. Before the life support discussion goes any further." "You are a nurse who has been employed here for less than 2 weeks, he said. His voice had dropped half an octave. "And you are speaking to the chief of neurology. I would suggest very carefully considering the professional implications of what you're doing." "I have considered them," Olivia said. "I would suggest you consider the professional implications of sedating a potentially conscious patient before neurological evaluations." They stared at each other across the corridor. Then footsteps came from behind her, and she heard the voice of Admiral Carter saying calmly, "Dr. Halpern, we need to talk." Halpern looked past her and went very still. He recognized the Admiral, not from his civilian clothes, but from something in his bearing, the same thing Olivia had recognized, and from the fact that a flag officer visiting a patient ward at 8 in the morning in civilian clothes meant something very specific. This visit was unofficial, which meant it was also untrackable, which meant the Admiral was operating with deliberate deniability, which was a form of message all by itself. "Admiral Carter," Halpern said carefully, "I didn't realize you were here. We have a family consultation scheduled for—" "I was here at 5 this morning," the Admiral said, "and I would like you to explain to me why my son just gripped my hand." Another silence, longer this time. Halpern turned to Olivia. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The professorial patience was gone. What replaced it was harder and colder, and in that hardness she heard something she recognized, the sound of a man calculating his exposure. "Whatever you believe you observed this morning does not override 4 months of clinical evaluation. Then you should have no objection to an independent evaluation," the Admiral said. "I have already contacted Dr. Laura Kensington at Johns Hopkins. She will be here this afternoon." The words landed in the corridor like a stone dropped into still water. Halpern said nothing. "In the meantime," Admiral Carter continued, his voice carrying the exact tone of a man who had spent 3 decades giving orders that were not suggestions, "I am requesting that my son's sedation be reviewed and adjusted, and that no further steps toward life support removal be taken until Dr. Kensington has completed her evaluation. Is that going to be a problem? Halpern looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Olivia. Then he said, "I'll consult with hospital administration." "You do that," the Admiral said pleasantly. Halpern walked away. Quickly. Olivia let out a breath slowly enough that it didn't show. The Admiral turned to her and said, "Kensington can be here by 2 this afternoon." "That gives us about 6 hours," Olivia said. "I need to spend that time documenting everything I have, the sensor placement, the medication log, the responses I've observed, everything from this morning. I need a paper trail that Kensington can follow." "Then start," he said. "I'll stay here. Nobody is removing anything from my son's room today." She nodded and turned to go. "Nurse Bennett," he said. She turned back. "What you did last night, calling me directly, that took guts. I know what it cost you professionally to make that call." "Ethan's alive, sir," she said simply. "That's what it cost." She went to the nurse's station and began writing. For the next 5 hours, Olivia documented everything with the methodical precision of a woman who had learned in a combat environment that the record you kept when you had time was the thing that saved lives when you didn't. She pulled every entry from Ethan's chart that related to sedation management. She cross-referenced the timing of the lorazepam increases against the dates of the scheduled neurological evaluations. She found 3 instances, not 1, 3, where the dosage had been adjusted upward in the 48 to 72 hours before a formal consciousness assessment was scheduled. She printed the EEG calibration records and compared the current sensor positions against the original placement documentation from when Ethan was first admitted. She wrote a detailed clinical narrative describing every observation she had made over 11 days, the heart rate responses, the breathing changes, the eyelid tremor, the finger movements, with timestamps for each. She attached her personal notebook entries as supplementary documentation. By 12:30, she had a 47-page document. She sent a copy to the hospital's patient safety office, flagged urgent. She sent a copy to the office of the Naval Medical Inspector General. She sent a copy to Dr. Kensington directly at the email address the Admiral had provided. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at what she had built. 47 pages of evidence built in 11 days by one nurse who was new enough to still feel uncertain walking the corridors of this building. She thought about Dr. Halpern's face in the corridor that morning, the tightening around the eyes, the pause before the breath. She had seen people give themselves away in moments like that before, in interrogations she had witnessed overseas, in the split second when a person realizes that someone else knows something they thought was hidden. She thought about 3 instances of sedation increases before evaluations. She thought about moved EEG sensors. She thought about what it would mean if what she was beginning to suspect was actually true. Not negligence, not oversight, not a series of unfortunate coincidences, but something deliberate, something intentional. The thought was so large and so dark that she had been avoiding looking at it directly for 2 days. She looked at it now. If it was intentional, if someone had been systematically managing Ethan Carter's ability to respond before evaluations, then this was not a medical error. This was something else entirely. Something that had a different name. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that turned out to be the Admiral's personal cell. "Kensington just landed at Reagan. She'll be at the hospital by 1:45. Be ready." Olivia gathered her documents. She had 1 hour. Dr. Laura Kensington arrived at the hospital at 1:43 in the afternoon, and she was not what Olivia had expected. She was shorter than her professional photograph suggested, with sharp brown eyes behind thin-framed glasses, and the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had made a career out of being right in rooms full of people who were certain she was wrong. She shook Olivia's hand and said, "I read what you sent me on the plane. Walk me through it in person. Start from the beginning." They walked and talked for 22 minutes before entering room 114. Kensington went through the chart herself, page by page without speaking. She examined the EEG sensor placements with her own hands, pressing gently at each electrode, checking calibration. She reviewed the medication log on the hospital's electronic system, and at the 3 entries where sedation had been increased before evaluations, she stopped and read them twice each. Her expression did not change, but her jaw set in a way that Olivia recognized. Then she stood at the bedside and looked at Ethan for a long moment. She looked at Olivia. "Show me the technique you used this morning." Olivia stepped forward. She placed her fingers against the side of Ethan's neck, at the same location with the same pressure. She adjusted the angle. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Ethan's hand lifted off the bed. His fingers reached toward the sound of his father's breathing. The Admiral was standing at the foot of the bed, and this time, when Admiral Carter moved to take his son's hand, Ethan's grip lasted for 6 full seconds. Dr. Kensington watched every moment of it without making a sound. Then she walked to the EEG monitor and looked at the readings being produced with the sensors in their current positions. She looked at them for a long time. Then she pulled the sensor placement chart from the file, compared the current positions to the original, and placed 2 of the sensors back in their original positions herself. The temporal and parietal placements that had been adjusted for patient comfort. She looked at the new readings. She pressed her lips together and looked at Olivia. "His brain is active," she said. "He is producing cortical responses. This man is not in a vegetative state." She paused. "He never was." Admiral Carter put one hand flat on the bed rail and leaned on it for a moment, as if something had gone out of his legs. Kensington turned away from the monitor and said, with the calm precision of someone who chose every word deliberately, "The sedation needs to be reduced immediately, and this chart needs to be reviewed by the hospital's legal and ethics committee before the day is out. Because what I'm looking at is not a diagnostic error." She looked toward the door, as if she could see Halpern somewhere down the corridor. "What I'm looking at is a pattern." Olivia said nothing. She had been carrying that word in the back of her mind for 2 days. Pattern. It was a different word than mistake. It implied direction. It implied intention. It implied that someone had known exactly what they were doing. She looked at Ethan. His hand had relaxed again, resting on the blanket. But his heart rate was still elevated above baseline. 11 beats. The same 11 beats it had held since his father first walked into the room and said, "Hey, kid." She looked at that number on the monitor and thought, he knows we're fighting for him. Somehow, through all of it, through 4 months and wrong diagnoses and sedatives and moved sensors and a system that had decided to stop looking, he had held on. He had kept reaching. He had kept moving that finger toward the sound of a voice that told him someone was still there. She thought about what that required of a human being. To be trapped, conscious, unable to speak, unable to move enough to make anyone believe you, and to keep trying anyway. To keep pushing through the medication and the silence and the days blurring into each other with nothing but the sound of machines and the occasional voice that didn't wait for an answer. To refuse, in the most fundamental sense of the word, to disappear. She looked at Admiral Carter, who was standing at his son's side with his hand covering his son's hand, and she looked at his face and she thought, like father, like son. Dr. Kensington was already on her phone in the corridor, calling the hospital's chief medical officer. Her voice was level and completely unambiguous. "This is Dr. Laura Kensington, Johns Hopkins. I am calling from Walter Reed regarding patient Ethan Carter. I need you to convene an emergency ethics review within the next 2 hours. Yes, today. No, it cannot wait. What I have found in this patient's chart constitutes a potential pattern of deliberate mismanagement. And if you would like to discuss jurisdiction, I'm happy to do that, right after I finish my call to the Naval Inspector General's office." The corridor went very quiet. Olivia stood in the doorway of room 114 and listened to the future begin to move. She had made the call nobody else was going to make. She had used a technique nobody in this building was authorized to use. She had gone around every layer of institutional protection and directly to a man powerful enough to make the walls move. And now the walls were moving. She turned back into the room, back to Ethan, and sat down in the chair beside his bed, the same chair she had been sitting in for 11 days. She said quietly, "We've got you now." On the monitor above the bed, his heart rate held steady, 11 beats above baseline. Still fighting. The Emergency Ethics Committee convened at 3:47 that afternoon in a conference room on the 5th floor of Walter Reed, and by the time the last person sat down, there were 11 people in the room. Hospital legal counsel, the chief medical officer, Dr. Sandra Okafor, 2 members of the Patient Safety Board, a representative from the Naval Medical Command, Dr. Laura Kensington, and Olivia Bennett, who had been told by 3 separate administrators in the previous 2 hours that her attendance was optional, which was institutional language for they would have strongly preferred she not be there at all. She was there. Admiral Carter was not in the room. He was in room 114, sitting beside his son's bed, and he had made clear to the chief medical officer that he intended to stay there for the duration of whatever needed to happen next, and that he would be available by phone if required. The phrasing he used was polite. The tone he used communicated that this was not a negotiation. Dr. Halpern was not in the room either. He had been asked to remain available, but had not been invited to attend. That absence, Olivia understood, was itself a statement. Dr. Okafor opened the meeting without preamble. She was a careful woman, thorough and deliberate, and Olivia had the sense that she had spent the last 2 hours doing something similar to what Olivia had done for the past 11 days. Looking at something she had initially explained away and being forced, slowly and reluctantly, to consider that the explanation didn't hold. "Dr. Kensington," Okafor said, "please summarize your findings for the committee." Kensington laid it out with surgical precision. She described Ethan's response to vagus nerve stimulation, the purposeful hand movement, the directed reach, the grip that lasted 6 seconds. She described the EEG sensor displacement and what the corrected readings showed. She described the cortical activity that the properly placed sensors revealed, activity that was incompatible with a diagnosis of persistent vegetative state. And then she described the medication pattern. 3 separate lorazepam increases, all in the 48 to 72 hours before scheduled consciousness evaluations. Each increase significant enough to substantially suppress voluntary motor activity. No documented clinical justification for any of them. She put the printed medication log on the table and let it sit there. The room was very quiet. Then the hospital's legal counsel, a man named Gerald Marsh, said carefully, "Dr. Kensington, is it possible these dosage adjustments reflect clinical judgment calls that simply weren't documented with a level of detail we'd prefer to see?" "No," Kensington said. Marsh blinked. "Could you elaborate?" "The timing is too precise," Kensington said. 3 times in a 4-month period, sedation was increased within 72 hours of a formal evaluation. The probability that this represents coincidental clinical judgment without documentation 3 times in sequence is not something I'm willing to assign to chance. She looked at Marsh steadily. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I know what coincidence looks like. This is not it." Olivia watched Gerald Marsh write something on his notepad. She watched him underline it. She watched his pen pause above the paper for a moment after he finished. Okafor said, "What is your clinical recommendation, Dr. Kensington?" "Immediate reduction of lorazepam to baseline levels. Full neurological reassessment within 48 hours once the sedative has cleared his system. Suspension of any life support transition planning pending the outcome of that reassessment." Kensington paused. "And a formal investigation into the prescribing history." The Naval Medical Command representative, A captain named Torres said, "What kind of investigation?" Kensington looked at him. "The kind that determines whether what happened to Ethan Carter was negligence or something with a different name." Another silence, longer this time. Olivia thought about that something with a different name. She had been thinking about it since the night before, since she had sat in the break room with a sandwich she couldn't taste, and turned the medication timing over in her mind like a stone she kept finding heavier every time she picked it up. She had wanted to be wrong about it. She had told herself she was probably wrong about it. But sitting in this room now, watching 11 people stare at a printed medication log and say nothing, she understood that she was not wrong. That whatever she's circling, the people in this room were circling it too. And none of them wanted to be the first one to say the word. Dr. Okafor was the one who said it, finally, in the careful, qualified language of institutional medicine. "We will be requesting a full internal review of all prescribing decisions made in relation to this patient over the last 4 months. Pending that review, Dr. Halpern's clinical authority over this case is suspended, effective immediately." Gerald Marsh started to say something. Okafor looked at him once. He stopped. "Dr. Kensington will assume primary oversight of Ethan Carter's care until a permanent attending is assigned," Okafor continued. "Nurse Bennett." She turned to Olivia directly, for the first time since the meeting began. "Your observations over the past 11 days are entered into the official record as of this moment. You are to be commended for the thoroughness of your documentation." Commended. Olivia thought about that word. 11 days ago, she had walked into this hospital as a new hire who wasn't sure yet which elevator was fastest. She had documented a finger movement in a spiral notebook. She had made a phone call that could have ended her career. She said, "Thank you, Dr. Okafor. With respect, what happens to Dr. Halpern now?" Okafor looked at her steadily. "That depends on what the internal review finds. And if the review finds what Dr. Kensington's findings suggest it will find," a pause, "then the appropriate authorities will be notified, and this will move beyond the hospital's jurisdiction." Okafor closed her folder. "That is all for now." The meeting lasted 41 minutes total. It was the most consequential 41 minutes Olivia had spent in any room since a command post in Kunar province in 2019, when a decision made in under an hour had determined whether 3 soldiers made it to surgery in time. All 3 had made it. She was beginning to allow herself to believe Ethan Carter would too. She went back to room 114 at 4:38 and told the Admiral what had been decided. He listened without interrupting, standing at the side of his son's bed with his arms crossed and his eyes on Ethan's face the entire time she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's the timeline on the sedation reduction?" "Dr. Kensington has already written the order. They're reducing the drip now. The lorazepam should be at baseline within 6 to 8 hours." She paused. "After that, it could take another 24 to 48 hours for the suppression effects to fully clear his system." The Admiral nodded slowly. "So we wait." "We wait," she confirmed. He looked at his son. "He's been doing that for 4 months, waiting." His voice was steady, but there was something under it that she heard clearly. The particular ache of a parent who has spent months standing outside a door they couldn't open. "I can manage another 48 hours." She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. Not because she had nothing else to do. There were notes to write, follow-up documentation to file, 3 separate messages from the patient safety office she hadn't answered yet. But she sat down because she had learned a long time ago that the moments right after a battle turns are the moments when people most need someone simply to be present with them. "Tell me about him," she said, "before the accident." The Admiral looked at her. For a moment she thought he was going to say no, or change the subject, or retreat into the reserved practicality he had maintained since he walked off that elevator at 4:58 that morning. Instead, he pulled the other chair to the bedside and sat down. He said, He was the worst student I ever met. She blinked. Middle school, high school, grades were catastrophic. Teachers loved him. He was charming, funny, curious about everything that wasn't on the syllabus. But sitting still in a classroom for 6 hours a day? He shook his head. He used to tell me the chairs made him feel like he was sinking, like if he sat in one long enough, he'd disappear into it. He paused. The Navy fixed that, the moment he had something physical to fight against. Water, endurance, the kind of training that breaks most people in the first 2 weeks. He came alive, like he'd been waiting for something that matched his wiring. Olivia looked at Ethan. How far was he into SEAL training? 8 weeks from completion, the Admiral said, and then quietly, 8 weeks. She didn't say anything. She let that number sit in the room. After a member said, he called me the night before the accident. We talked for about 20 minutes. He was exhausted. I could hear it in his voice. But he was happy in a way that's hard to describe. The kind of happy that comes from doing something so hard that it strips everything else away and you find out what you're actually made of. He paused. He said, Dad, I finally understand why you stayed in for 30 years. The Admiral was quiet for a moment. That was the last conversation I had with him. Olivia pressed her lips together. She didn't trust herself to speak for a few seconds. Then she said, You'll have another one. He looked at her. He's still in there, she said, and he knows you're here. His heart rate has been elevated since you walked into this room this morning, sir. 11 beats above baseline. That is not a coincidence. The Admiral looked at the monitor. He stared at it for a long time. Then, very quietly, he said, 11 beats. 11 beats, she confirmed. He turned back to his son and said nothing else for a while. But something in the set of his shoulders changed. Something that had been braced against a weight shifted very slightly, as if the weight itself had shifted first. It was 8:56 that evening when Dr. Halpern was found. Olivia was at the nurse's station completing her documentation when she heard the rapid footsteps coming from the direction of the administrative corridor. The kind of footsteps that meant something had happened. The specific rhythm of urgency that she had learned to recognize in trauma environments. She stood up before anyone reached her. The security supervisor, a man named Henderson, came around the corner with 2 hospital administrators behind him, and his face was carrying the particular expression of someone who had been handed a situation that was significantly outside anything his training had prepared him for. Nurse Bennett, he said, Dr. Halpern just attempted to access Ethan Carter's electronic medical record from a terminal on the 2nd floor. She stared at him. His access should have been suspended. It was, Henderson said. The system flagged the attempt and locked him out. But we reviewed the access log. He tried to log in 4 times in a 12-minute period starting about 20 minutes ago. And one of the administrators caught him physically attempting to access the medication storage room on the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor was where controlled substances were stored, where lorazepam was stored. She said, Where is he now? Building security has him in the administrative suite. Hospital counsel is with him. She sat back down slowly. She thought about the tightening around his eyes in the corridor that morning, the pause before the breath, the calculations she had seen him do in real time when he realized the Admiral was behind her. She thought about a man who had spent 40 years building a reputation, a career, an identity built entirely on the certainty of his own judgment, and what that man might do when he understood that certainty was about to be dismantled in public, in writing, in a room with 11 witnesses. She picked up her phone and called the Admiral. He answered on the first ring. Sir, she said, something has happened. You need to hear this. She told him quickly and clearly. When she finished, there was a silence on the line. Then Admiral Carter said, in a tone she had never heard from him before, not the controlled grief, not the military composure, but something colder and more precise, the voice of a man shifting into a mode he had spent a career developing. Is my son's room secure? She was already on her feet. I'm going there now. She covered the distance to room 114 in 40 seconds. She pushed the door open and scanned the room. Ethan was in the bed. The monitors were reading normally. The medication drip was running exactly as Dr. Kensington had ordered it. Nothing had been touched. She stood inside the door and let out a slow breath. Her phone buzzed. A text from the Admiral. "I've notified Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They will be on site within 2 hours. Don't let anyone touch that chart or that medication line. No one. I don't care what title they have." She typed back, "Understood. I'm in the room. I'm not leaving." She sat down in the chair beside the bed. She looked at the medication drip, and then at the monitors, and then at Ethan's face. Still, pale, young, 24 years old, and someone in this building had decided, apparently with deliberate intention, that 24 was going to be the end of his story. She felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something more fundamental than either. Something that came from 3 years of watching young men and women fight for their lives in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. And understanding viscerally, at the level below thought, that life was not supposed to be disposed of casually, that it was not supposed to be weighed against resources and found wanting, that a 24-year-old who had given everything to serve his country was not a problem to be managed. She sat with that feeling for a while. Then she set it aside, the way she had learned to set things aside when there was still work to do. She looked at Ethan and said, "NCIS is coming. You're going to have a lot of people in your corner very soon." His hand moved. Not much. A slow shift of the fingers. The same deliberate movement she had been documenting for 11 days. But this time she was close enough to see it clearly, and this time she knew what it meant. Not a reflex. Not a brainstem response. A person trapped in a body that had been chemically restrained for months, doing the only thing he could do, answering. She put her hand over his and held it there. The NCIS agents arrived at 10:43 that night. 2 of them, a senior agent named Carver and a younger agent named Diaz, who took notes and said very little but missed nothing. They spent 40 minutes in the administrative suite with Dr. Halpern, and then they came to room 114 and spent 20 minutes with Olivia, going through her documentation page by page, asking precise, unhurried questions. Carver had the manner of someone who had spent a career separating fact from interpretation, and he asked the same questions 3 different ways sometimes, which Olivia recognized as a technique and answered exactly the same way each time, which she could tell he also recognized. When they finished, Carver closed his notebook and said, "You're going to be asked to make a formal statement." "I know," she said. "I'm ready." He looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been a nurse?" 7 years, 3 of them with special operations in Afghanistan. He nodded slowly, as if something he had already suspected had been confirmed. "That's where you learned the vagus nerve technique?" "Yes." "And you used it without hospital authorization?" "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "That took considerable courage, Nurse Bennett." "It took 11 days of watching someone fight to be heard," she said. "The courage was his." Carver and Diaz left at 11:27. Halpern had not been formally arrested yet. The investigation would require time, documentation review, consultation with the U.S. Attorney's Office, but he had been escorted from the building, and his hospital credentials had been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Okafor had signed that order herself at 11:15 with Kensington standing beside her. The ward was quieter after midnight. The overnight staff moved through their rounds with the particular, subdued focus of people who understood that something significant had happened in their hospital today, even if they didn't yet know all of it. Olivia stayed in room 114. She had been awake for 21 hours. She was not tired in any way that she could feel yet. The adrenaline of the day was still metabolizing, but she knew it was coming, knew that at some point in the next few hours, her body was going to call in the debt she had been accumulating since 4 in the morning. She sat in the chair with her notebook open on her knee, not writing anymore, just holding it. She thought about what Kensington had said in the conference room. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I know what coincidence looks like. This is not it." She thought about those 3 dosage increases, the moved sensors, a system that had been producing the diagnosis that someone needed it to produce. She thought about what Dr. Okafor had said. That depends on what the internal review finds, and this will move beyond the hospital's jurisdiction. She understood that what came next was going to be long and complicated and fought at every stage. Institutions did not expose themselves willingly. Careers did not collapse without resistance. Whatever had happened in this hospital over the past 4 months was going to be difficult to prove with the specificity that a criminal standard required. And there were going to be lawyers and delays and moments when it looked like the whole thing might simply dissolve into ambiguity. She knew that. But she also knew that Ethan Carter's lorazepam levels were dropping, that the sedative suppressing his ability to speak was clearing his system hour by hour, that somewhere in the next 24 to 48 hours, the chemical silence that had been imposed on him was going to lift enough for him to begin pushing back against it in ways that no one could dismiss as reflex activity. She knew that because she had watched him fight for 11 days with his system flooded with a drug designed to keep him quiet. She knew what he was going to do when that drug was no longer in his way. She looked at him, at the monitors, at the steady 11 beats above baseline that had held through the entire day like a signal being broadcast on a frequency that only she had been tuned to at the right moment. At 2:17 in the morning, the Admiral came back. She had assumed he had gone home for the night. She looked up from her notebook when the door opened, and he came in quietly and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his son. He had changed his jacket. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine down the hall. He set one on the small table next to her chair without saying anything about it. She said, "You should sleep, sir." "So should you," he said. He pulled the other chair back to the bedside and sat down. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at Ethan for a while without speaking. Then he said, quietly, into the stillness of the room, "You know what he used to say when he was a kid, when things got hard, when school was bad or something wasn't going his way?" He paused. He used to say, "Dad, I'm not done yet." Just that. "I'm not done yet." He looked at Ethan. 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table over homework he hated, and he'd look up and say it like he was filing a report. A breath. "I'm not done yet." Olivia looked at the monitors. At 2:17 and 40 seconds in the morning, Ethan Carter's right hand moved again. Slow and deliberate and unmistakable. His fingers curled into a loose fist, the way they had been doing for 11 days, whenever there was a voice in the room he recognized. The Admiral leaned forward. He put his hand over his son's fist and held it. He said, "I know, kid, I know." And in the blue-green glow of the monitors, in the quiet of a room that had come closer to a grave than either of them would ever be able to fully articulate, a father and son sat together in the middle of the night and waited for morning. The medication drip ran slowly. The sedative levels fell. And somewhere inside a body that the system had declared finished, a 24-year-old Navy SEAL trainee continued doing the only thing he had ever known how to do. He refused to be done. Morning came into room 114 the way it always did, quietly, without announcement, the monitors continuing their steady rhythm as if nothing had changed overnight. But everything had changed. Olivia felt it the moment she opened her eyes in the chair, stiff-necked and dry-mouthed from a sleep she hadn't intended to take, and saw the early light and heard the different quality of the ward outside the door. There was more movement than usual, more voices, the particular energy of a place that had been disturbed at its foundations and hadn't yet settled back into its normal shape. She checked her watch. 6:12. She had been asleep for roughly 4 hours. Admiral Carter was still in the chair across the bed from her, upright, awake, holding his coffee cup from the night before. He looked like a man who had not slept at all and had made peace with that decision somewhere around 3 in the morning. She looked immediately at the monitors. Ethan's heart rate was at baseline, which was different from what she was used to seeing. The 11-beat elevation had finally dropped overnight. For a half second, her stomach tightened. Then she looked at the ventilator readout, at the respiratory pattern, and understood. The baseline itself had changed. His resting heart rate had dropped 3 beats per minute, below what it had been when she first took his case, which meant his autonomic nervous system was recalibrating, which meant the sedative suppression was beginning to lift. She sat up straighter. "How long has his rate been like that?" she asked. The Admiral looked at the monitor. "Changed about 90 minutes ago. I was going to wake you, but it seemed stable." "It is stable," she said. "It's better than stable. His baseline is dropping, which means his system is starting to regulate without the lorazepam pushing it. This is what we want to see." She stood up, stretched her neck, and moved to the bedside. "Ethan." She said his name clearly, at normal volume, the way she always did. "It's Olivia. It's morning. Your father is here." She watched his face, his eyelids, his hands. For a long moment, nothing. Then, the left eyelid moved. Not the flutter she had been documenting for 11 days. Something more deliberate. A slow, sustained effort to open, like a door pushing against weight. It didn't open, not yet. But the effort was visible and unmistakable. And when she looked up at the Admiral, he had both hands gripped around the bedrail, and his knuckles were white. She said, "That is new." He said, "I see it." She picked up her notebook and wrote the time. 6:14. Attempted voluntary eye-opening. Left lid. Sustained effort lasting approximately 3 seconds. Consistent with sedative clearance and emerging consciousness. She underlined the last 2 words. She called Dr. Kensington at 6:21. Kensington answered on the second ring, which told Olivia she had also not slept well. "His baseline heart rate dropped 3 beats, and I just observed sustained attempted eye-opening," Olivia said. "Left lid, 3 seconds of effort." A brief silence on the line. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Kensington said. The call ended. Olivia looked at the Admiral. "She's coming." He nodded. He looked at Ethan. Then he leaned forward and said in the direct, clear voice of a man who had spent his career giving his son 2 things: high expectations and absolute belief. "Ethan, I'm right here. You've been fighting for 4 months and I didn't know it, and I'm sorry for that. But I know it now, and I need you to keep going. You hear me? Keep going." The left eyelid moved again, held for 2 seconds, released. The Admiral exhaled to his nose. It was the most undone Olivia had ever seen him look. She said quietly, "He hears you." Kensington arrived at 7:03 with 2 members of her team from Johns Hopkins, a younger neurologist named Dr. Prasad, and a neuro-rehabilitation specialist named Dr. Ewan, who had driven through the night from Baltimore. She came through the door of room 114 without slowing, already in clinical mode, and went straight to the monitors without greeting anyone. She reviewed the overnight readings for approximately 90 seconds. Then she turned to Olivia. "Tell me everything since midnight." Olivia told her. The baseline drop, the eyelid movement at 6:14, the second attempt at 6:29. Kensington listened with her arms crossed and her eyes on Ethan's face. And when Olivia finished, Kensington said to Dr. Ewan, "Start the full responsiveness protocol. I want a Glasgow assessment every 30 minutes. Ewan moved to the bedside and began. The Glasgow Coma Scale was the standard clinical tool for assessing consciousness. It measured eye opening, verbal response, and motor response on a 15-point scale. A score of 3 meant no response at all. A score of 15 meant fully conscious and oriented. In his last formal evaluation, Ethan Carter had been scored at 4, the lowest possible score that still registered any response. Ewan worked methodically. He spoke Ethan's name. He applied a standardized pain stimulus to the nail bed. He watched the eye response. He called out each finding to Prasad, who recorded it. Eye response, none to voice, minimal to pain stimulus. Verbal response, none. Motor response, withdrawal on pain stimulus. Right hand purposeful movement to voice. UN looked at Kensington. 7, he said. 7. 3 points higher than the last official evaluation. In a patient who had been scored, for 4 months, by a neurologist who had been managing his sedation before each test. Kensington said, baseline established. We reassess at 0, 800. The next assessment was at 801, and Ethan Carter scored 9. The room went very still when Ewan called it out. 9 on a Glasgow scale meant the gap between where Ethan was and where he needed to be considered conscious in communicating was closing at a rate that no one in the room had quite dared to predict out loud. In 2 assessments, 90 minutes apart, he had moved 6 points. Kensington turned to Prasad and said something in a low voice that Olivia couldn't hear. Prasad nodded and left the room quickly. What's happening? Admiral Carter asked. His voice was controlled, but the question underneath the question was audible to everyone. Kensington turned to face him fully, which was something Olivia had noticed about her. She always turned to face the person she was addressing, fully, no partial attention, no multitasking during conversations that mattered. His rate of response improvement is faster than I anticipated, Kensington said. That tells us that the sedative suppression was doing significantly more work than the underlying brain injury. In other words, his brain is more intact than 4 months of assessments suggested, possibly much more intact. The Admiral absorbed that. What does that mean for recovery? It means I want to talk about reducing ventilator support, Kensington said. Not removing it, reducing it. I want to see if he can begin initiating some breaths independently. She paused. If he can, that changes everything. The trial of reduced ventilator support began at 9:15. Kensington was at the bedside herself. Prasad was on her left. Ewan was monitoring the respiratory readings. Olivia stood at the foot of the bed with her notebook and tried to keep her own breathing even and slow. The ventilator rate was reduced by 30%. The room held its breath. Ethan Carter took a breath on his own. It was shallow. It was effortful. The monitor showed the strain of it in real time. But it was his, initiated by his own respiratory system, independent of the machine that had been breathing for him for 4 months. He took another. Kensington said very quietly, "There you are." Olivia pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth for a moment. She looked at the Admiral. He was standing at the bed rail with his hand over his son's hand, and his head bowed, and his shoulders very still, the way a person goes still when they are trying to hold something enormous inside themselves. At 9:47, Ethan Carter opened his eyes. Not fully, not clearly. The left eye more than the right, both unfocused, both struggling against the weight of 4 months of sedation and inactivity. But they opened. They pointed, imprecisely, with visible effort, toward the sound of his father's voice. Admiral Carter said, "Hey, kid." The same 2 words he had said when he first walked into room 114 at 5 in the morning the day before. Ethan's lips moved. No sound came out. The ventilator tube prevented speech. But the movement was there. The intention was there. Something that looked unmistakably like trying. Kensington was already making notes. She spoke without looking up. "We're going to need to discuss extubation," Olivia said. "How soon? If he maintains this trajectory, we could be looking at a trial extubation within 48 hours. For the next several hours, room 114 became the most closely monitored space in the hospital. Kensington's team ran assessments every 30 minutes with meticulous precision. Each assessment showed movement, not always dramatic movement, sometimes a half-point shift, sometimes a full point, but it was consistently upward, consistently in one direction, like a tide coming in that no one had believed existed. At 11:30, NCIS agent Carver came back. He knocked on the doorframe of room 114, before entering, which Olivia found unexpectedly courteous. She stepped out into the corridor to speak with him, leaving Kensington's team and the Admiral at the bedside. Carver said, "We need to talk about Dr. Halpern." She said, "What happened?" "He's retained legal counsel and is refusing to make any further statements. Standard procedure at this point." Carver paused. "But we spent the morning going through his communications records, phone logs, email, the hospital's internal messaging system." He looked at her steadily. "He wasn't alone in this." She went very still. "What do you mean?" "The prescribing decisions, the sensor adjustments, some of them were coordinated. There are communications between Halpern and two other individuals. One of them is a hospital administrator. The other is external to the hospital." She stared at him. "External. We're not prepared to release a name yet. The investigation is ongoing." He held her gaze. "But I want you to know, the scope of what happened here is larger than one doctor making bad clinical decisions. This was organized. And the reason Ethan Carter was the target of it is something we're still working to establish." He paused. "I thought you deserved to know that, given your role in uncovering it." She said, "Is Ethan safe right now, physically, in this building?" "We have 2 agents stationed in the corridor," Carver said. "He's safe." She nodded slowly. She thought about what organized meant. She thought about why anyone would want to ensure that a 24-year-old Navy SEAL trainee, the son of a 3-star admiral, did not regain consciousness. She turned that over and looked at every angle of it, and none of the angles were comfortable. She said, "Whatever you need from me, I'm available." "We know," Carver said. "You've been available since day one." He almost smiled. "We'll be in touch." She went back into room 114. She didn't tell the Admiral what Carver had said. Not yet. The investigation was ongoing. The Admiral had enough to carry, and there was something else happening in room 114 that required every person's full attention. Because at 12:44 in the afternoon, the Glasgow assessment came back at 11. 11 out of 15. UN called it out, and Kensington put down her pen, and Prasad stopped typing, and for exactly 3 seconds, the room held something that had no clinical name, just a collective human recognition that the distance between where they had been 48 hours ago and where they were right now was something that most people in their profession would spend entire careers and never witness. The Admiral said, 11. "What does 11 mean?" Kensington said, "It means your son is aware of where he is. It means he knows you're in the room. It means the brain that everyone told you was gone was never gone." She looked at the Admiral without any professional distance left in her expression. Just one person telling another person the truth as plainly as it could be told. "He's coming back, Admiral Carter. He's been trying to come back since the day he arrived here." The Admiral turned away from the room. He walked 2 steps toward the window and stood there with his back to everyone for about 30 seconds. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. Olivia looked at her notebook and then looked at the ceiling and thought about 3 years in Afghanistan, about all the times she had stood at the edge of an outcome and not known which way it was going to fall. This was the other side of that. This was what the good ones felt like. She had almost forgotten. When the Admiral turned back around, his eyes were red, but his face was composed. He said, "What do we need to do next?" Kensington said, "We need to talk about extubation." They extubated Ethan Carter at 3:55 in the afternoon, 24 hours ahead of the earliest timeline Kensington had projected. He had been maintaining his own respiratory efforts so consistently, so strongly, that Kensington made the call 90 minutes before they had planned to. She stood at the head of the bed herself and walked through the procedure with her team. And Olivia stood against the wall because this was not her moment to be at the bedside. This was Kensington's work. And she respected the boundary precisely because she understood how important precision was at this stage. The tube came out. Ethan coughed. A long, raw, desperate cough that sounded like something surfacing from underwater. His face contorted with the effort of it. His hands gripped the bedrail. And then the coughing eased, and he was breathing on his own. Actually breathing, his own chest rising and falling at his own rhythm for the first time in 4 months. And the sound of it, that unassisted breath, filled the room like something that had been absent for so long. Its return made everything feel slightly different. Kensington said, "Ethan, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, unfocused, exhausted, but open. "Can you squeeze my hand?" He squeezed. She said, "Good. You're doing very well. You're at Walter Reed. You've been here for a while. You're safe." She paused. "Your father is here." The Admiral moved to the bedside. He leaned close to his son's face and said, very quietly, "I'm here, Ethan. Right here." Ethan's lips moved. The first attempt produced no sound, just the shape of words, the mechanics of speech trying to restart after 4 months of silence. The second attempt produced a sound that was barely a whisper, cracked and raw, and barely recognizable as language. But it was language. Admiral Carter leaned closer. "What was that? Say it again." And Ethan Carter, 24 years old, 8 weeks from completing SEAL training, who had spent 4 months conscious and trapped and fighting with every resource left to him against a system designed to keep him silent, looked at his father and whispered, with every bit of strength he had left, "Not done yet." The Admiral's composure, which had survived 31 years of naval service and 48 of the most brutal hours of his life, broke completely. He pressed his forehead against his son's, and he wept. Not the restrained, controlled expression Olivia had seen from him before, but something total and unguarded. The release of 4 months of a grief so enormous, it had required every ounce of his training just to carry it. He didn't try to stop it. He didn't try to compose himself. He just held his son's hand and let it come. Kensington stepped back. Prasad and Ewan stepped back. Everyone in the room stepped back and let that moment belong entirely to the 2 people at the center of it. Olivia pressed herself against the wall and looked at her notebook and realized she had been gripping it so hard her fingers were white. She unclenched them deliberately. She breathed. She looked at the ceiling for a moment and thought, "This is why. This exact moment right here. This is why you make the call nobody else is going to make. This is why you don't stay quiet when you see a finger move." She did not cry. She had learned in Afghanistan to move the tears to somewhere they could wait until the work was done. She was not done yet either. At 4:32, Kensington came to stand beside her. They both looked at the bedside, the Admiral sitting there now, both of Ethan's hands in both of his. His son's eyes closed again, but his breathing steady and independent and real. Kensington said quietly, "I've been doing this for 22 years. I have never seen anything like what you did here." Olivia said, "I just watched carefully." "No," Kensington said, "you watched when no one else would. You documented when no one else thought it was worth documenting. You risked your career on the judgment of your own eyes when every authority in this building told you your eyes were wrong." She paused. "And you were right," Olivia said. "Will he make a full recovery?" "I won't use the word full," Kensington said carefully. "There will be rehabilitation. There will be time. His brain has been suppressed for 4 months, and before that it suffered a genuine hypoxic injury. But the extent of what we're seeing today suggests that the injury was far less severe than anyone believed. Because the injury we were measuring wasn't just the hypoxia. We were measuring the hypoxia plus 4 months of heavy sedation and the intentional muting of every signal his brain was trying to send." She paused. "When you take the sedation away, you find out what's actually there. And what's actually there, in Ethan Carter's case, is a great deal more than anyone in this building was willing to admit." Olivia said, "He's going to be angry when he understands what happened." "Yes," Kensington agreed. "He is." "Good," Olivia said. She thought a SEAL was something to be angry about, was probably exactly the kind of patient who would fight hardest through rehabilitation. "Good. At 5:17, Admiral Carter came to find her. Ethan had fallen into a natural sleep, not a sedated unconsciousness, but the genuine, exhausted sleep of a body that had done an enormous amount of work in a very short time. Kensington's team was monitoring every reading. The NCIS agents were still in the corridor. The hospital, in the particular way that institutions have of absorbing seismic events and continuing to function around them, had moved into a kind of stunned normalcy. People doing their jobs, speaking in lower voices than usual, understanding that something had happened here that they would talk about for years. The Admiral found Olivia at the nurse's station. She was on her third cup of coffee and had started on the documentation she owed the Patient Safety Office, 2 attorneys, and the Naval Inspector General's office. He sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, which she took as a sign that the formality between them had shifted into something else over the past 2 days. He spoke. "I heard him," she said. "Not done yet. He said it the way you say something you are going to be hearing for the rest of your life. He said that to me when he was 12 years old. Over math homework." She looked at him. "Sounds about right." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "NCIS told me there are other people involved. Beyond Halpern." She met his eyes. "Yes, sir. They told me that too." "Do you know why?" His voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was the other question. The one that a father asks when he realizes his son was not simply the victim of medical negligence, but of something deliberate, something targeted, something that had a reason behind it, even if that reason was not yet visible. "No," she said honestly, "not yet." He looked at the surface of the desk for a moment. "Someone wanted him gone," he said. "My son. Someone decided he needed to disappear and found a doctor willing to make it look like medicine." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said everything. But she heard what it cost him to say it. "That's what we're dealing with." "Yes," she said. "That's what we're dealing with." He looked at her. "Are you afraid?" She thought about it honestly before answering. "No," she said. "I was afraid 11 days ago that I was wrong. That was the only thing that scared me in this whole situation. Being wrong." She paused. "I wasn't wrong." He studied her face for a long moment. "No," he said, "you were not." He leaned forward slightly. "I want you to know, whatever protection I can provide you through this investigation, you have it. Whatever resources I can bring to bear to make sure your career not only survives this, but is recognized for what you did, that is going to happen. I will make certain of it." She said, "With respect, sir, I didn't do this for my career." "I know that," he said. "That's exactly why I'm going to make sure your career reflects it." She held his gaze and then nodded once. "Thank you." He stood. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. She had seen it before, in Afghanistan, on the faces of commanders who had just watched someone under impossible conditions make the right call when everything was working against them. It was not admiration exactly. It was something more specific than that. Recognition. The recognition of one person by another who understands what the action actually cost. He said, "My son is alive tonight because you refuse to be quiet." He paused. "That is something I will carry for the rest of my life." He went back to room 114. Olivia sat at the nurse's station and looked at the blank document on the screen in front of her, the statement she owed the Inspector General's office, and thought about what the Admiral had just said. "My son is alive tonight because you refuse to be quiet." She thought about the morning she had stood in a break room holding a sandwich she couldn't taste, and decided to make a phone call that could have ended everything she had worked for. She thought about what it had felt like to stand in that corridor and tell Dr. Halpern that she wanted his clinical reasoning documented, knowing full well that a 12-year veteran of institutional medicine could crush a nurse who had been on staff for 11 days without leaving a mark. She thought about Ethan's finger, moving slowly toward the sound of her voice. On day 9, when she was still only watching and not yet sure enough of herself to act. That finger, That single, deliberate movement, reaching through 4 months of chemical silence toward the nearest sound of a human being who might be listening. She put her hands on the keyboard and started to write. Outside in the corridor, the hospital continued. Machines beeped. Nurses moved through their rounds. The building held its rhythm the way buildings do, indifferent to the enormous things that happen inside them. But in room 114, a 24-year-old Navy SEAL trainee breathed on his own. In and out. In and out. Not done yet. The statement Olivia submitted to the Naval Inspector General's office ran to 63 pages by the time she finished it at 2 in the morning. She printed 2 copies, sealed them in separate envelopes, and put one in the hospital's outgoing mail and one in her own bag. Then she sat alone at the nurse's station, in the quiet of the overnight ward, and listened to the building breathe around her, and understood, with the particular clarity that only exhaustion can produce, that the part of this she could control was finished. What came next belonged to investigators and attorneys and institutional processes that moved at their own pace, regardless of urgency. She had handed over everything she had. The record was complete. Whatever happened to Dr. Halpern, whatever the NCIS investigation uncovered about the people behind him, whatever the hospital's internal review ultimately concluded, none of it could be changed by anything she did in the next several hours. The only thing left for her to do was go home and sleep. She did not go home and sleep. She went back to room 114 and sat in the chair until morning. 3 days after Ethan Carter spoke his first words, he was moved out of the intensive care unit. He was transferred to a private room on the rehabilitation floor, and the transfer itself, the act of watching the orderlies wheel his bed through the corridor, while he tracked the movement of the ceiling tiles with his eyes, felt to everyone who witnessed it like the kind of moment that deserves to be marked somehow, though no one could agree on how. Kensington walked alongside the bed the entire way. Admiral Carter walked on the other side. Olivia followed at the back of the group, notebook in hand, documenting the transfer because she had documented everything else, and she was not going to stop now. Ethan's eyes found hers when they stopped in the new room, and the orderlies were arranging the equipment. He was still weak, profoundly weak, the weakness of a body that had been immobile for 4 months, muscles that had atrophied past the point where they could reliably support basic movement. His voice, when he used it, was still rough and fractured, requiring enormous effort for short phrases. But his eyes were sharp. That was the thing that struck everyone who spent time with him in those first days. The contrast between the body's fragility and the absolute alertness in his eyes. Those were not the eyes of a man who had been anywhere near gone. They were the eyes of someone who had been watching from a locked room for 4 months and had just had the door opened. He looked at Olivia and said, with visible effort, 2 words, "You came." She said, "I was always here." He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them again. He said, "I heard you. The first day." His voice broke on the last word and he stopped and breathed through it. "You said my name." She had to look away for a second. She looked at the wall and thought about day 1, about standing at the side of a bed belonging to a man every authority in the building had declared unreachable, and introducing herself anyway, because she believed in some fundamental part of her that people could hear even when they couldn't answer. She had done it out of habit, out of training, out of a practice she had developed over years without ever being able to prove it mattered. It had mattered. She looked back at him. "I said your name every day," she told him. "Every single day." He said, "I know." The investigation moved faster than anyone expected and slower than everyone needed. The NCIS inquiry, running parallel to a separate Department of Defense Inspector General review, produced its first formal findings in the 3rd week after Ethan's extubation. Olivia was interviewed 5 more times in that period, each session longer and more specific than the last, each one drilling deeper into the timeline of her 11 days of observations and the medication irregularities she had flagged. She answered every question with the same precision she had used when she documented everything in her notebook. She did not speculate beyond what she had directly observed. She did not editorialize. She simply told the truth in sequence, the way a good medic reports what she sees, and let the investigators build the picture around it. The picture they built was worse than she had imagined. Agent Carver came to the hospital on a Thursday morning, 22 days after Ethan first spoke, and sat down across from Olivia in a consultation room with a folder in front of him that he opened deliberately, the way people open things they've been waiting to open. He said, "I can share some of what we've established. Not all of it. The investigation is still active. But you're central enough to this that you deserve to understand what you walked into." She said, "Tell me." Carver said, "Dr. Victor Halpern had a financial relationship with a private legal entity that stood to benefit significantly from Ethan Carter's death." She stared at him. He continued carefully, "Ethan Carter is the sole heir to a substantial estate held in trust by his late mother's family. The trust becomes accessible to a third-party beneficiary upon the death of the primary heir without living descendants. The third-party beneficiary is connected, through several layers of corporate structure, to individuals who had an existing professional relationship with Dr. Halpern." The room was completely silent. She said, "Someone hired Halpern to make sure Ethan didn't wake up. That is the working hypothesis of the investigation," Carver said. "We are not yet in a position to characterize the relationship as a direct hire. The financial connections are documented. The communications between Halpern and the other individuals involved are documented. The pattern of sedation management relative to evaluation schedules is documented." He paused. "The motive is documented. The rest is a matter of proving the direct link to the satisfaction of a federal prosecutor." She sat with that for a long moment. She thought about the morning she had stood in the corridor and told Halpern she wanted his clinical reasoning in writing. She thought about the way his eyes had tightened, just slightly, just for a moment, before he covered it. She thought about a young man lying in a bed in a room at the end of a hallway, fighting with the only weapons available to him, a finger that could barely move, a heart rate that climbed 9 beats when someone sat close enough to hold his hand, against a system that had been carefully constructed to ensure he never made it out. She said, "What happens to Halpern?" "Federal charges are expected within 60 days, Carver said. "The administrator with whom he was in communication has already entered a cooperation agreement with the U.S. attorney. The external party, the one I mentioned in our previous conversation, is currently outside the country." He paused. "That is being addressed." She nodded slowly. She thought about justice, about what that word meant in practice, about the gap between what should happen and what ultimately could be proven in a courtroom. She thought about Ethan, 2 floors above her right now, working with a physical therapist on grip strength exercises, fighting to rebuild a body that had been kept chemically paralyzed for 4 months. She thought about the 8 weeks of SEAL training he still had ahead of him, that he talked about with Dr. Ewan during their sessions, with a quiet intensity that made it clear it was not a question of whether, but of when. She said, "He doesn't know yet." About the financial motive. "No," Carver said. "That's the family's decision to make, in terms of timing." "The Admiral knows?" "Yes, I briefed him yesterday." She thought about that. She thought about Admiral Carter sitting in the chair by his son's bed at 2 in the morning, holding a cup of cold vending machine coffee, saying someone decided he needed to disappear and found a doctor willing to make it look like medicine. He had already known, somewhere in the intuition of a man who had spent 3 decades in a world of strategic threats, that this wasn't random. He had just been waiting for confirmation of the shape of it. She said, "Thank you for telling me." Carver said, "Thank you for starting the chain that made it possible to find." The rehabilitation floor had a different quality than the intensive care ward, where the ICU moved with urgency, with the compressed energy of continuous crisis. The rehab floor moved with a different kind of intensity, the deliberate, repetitive, unglamorous work of rebuilding. It was harder to watch in some ways than the acute crisis had been. The crisis had a momentum of its own. Rehabilitation was pure will, applied slowly, against resistance, with progress measured in degrees so small they were almost invisible from day to day. Ethan Carter was not a patient person by nature, and the physical therapist assigned to him, a former Army combat medic named Garrett, had within the first 48 hours developed the specific manner of someone who had decided that the most effective way to manage Ethan's frustration was to let it fuel the work rather than fight it. He let Ethan push harder than the standard protocol recommended. He adjusted the schedule to match the pace Ethan's anger set. He told Admiral Carter privately on day 4, "Your son is either going to be the fastest recovery I've ever managed, or he's going to tear something critical. Possibly both." The Admiral had said, "That sounds about right." Olivia visited every day. Not as his nurse, she was still on the neurology ward, still working her regular shifts, still carrying the patient load that had not changed while the earthquake of Ethan's case reshaped everything around it. She visited on her lunch breaks and sometimes before her shift started in the morning, stopping in for 15 minutes to check on him, the way you check on someone you have watched fight their way back from the edge and cannot quite make yourself stop worrying about just because the immediate crisis is resolved. On her 8th visit to the rehab floor, she walked in to find Ethan sitting up on the edge of the bed, without the bed rail, without assistance, back straight, hands on his knees. It was not a dramatic posture. It was not performed for effect. It was simply what it looked like when a person decided it was time and did the thing, regardless of what the schedule said. Garrett was standing 4 feet away with his arms crossed and an expression that was half alarm and have something that looked very much like professional respect. He said to Olivia, "He's been like this for 20 minutes. I told him to wait for me to set up." He said, and I quote, "I've been waiting for 4 months." Ethan looked at Olivia. His voice was stronger than it had been a week ago. Each day brought more of it back, more resonance, more ease. "I stood up this morning," he said, "before Garrett got here. Held it for about 8 seconds before my legs went." She said, 8 seconds is 8 seconds more than yesterday. 12 tomorrow, he said. Not a hope, a statement. She sat down in the chair across from him. She looked at his face, really looked at it, the way she had been looking at it since day one, with the same attention she had given every detail of his condition. What she saw was different now. His eyes were the same, that watchfulness, that absolute alertness that had never left even when everything else was suppressed. But around the eyes, in the set of his jaw, in something about the way he held himself, there was something new. Not bitterness, though he had every right to it. Not fragility, though any reasonable person in his position would have had grounds for that too. Something harder and quieter than either. Like a person who has been to a place that most people don't come back from and has returned with a knowledge that can't be unlearned. She said, "How are you doing?" Actually, not physically. He looked at her steadily. He said, "Garrett told me you're the one who found me." She said, "I was just paying attention." "The Admiral told me about the medication," he said, "about what Halpern was doing before each evaluation." He paused. "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. The difference between days when I could almost get there and days when it was like trying to move through cement. I thought I was losing. I thought my brain was just..." He stopped, breathed. "I thought I was going the wrong direction, and I was fighting as hard as I could fight and nothing was moving," she said quietly. "But you kept fighting anyway." "Yeah," he said. He looked at his hands. His grip had come back significantly. Garrett had him at 40% of his pre-accident strength and climbing. "You know what it's like? To be completely inside yourself with nothing working and not know if anyone outside can tell. It's like you're underwater and you can hear voices above the surface, but you can't get there and you can't tell if they can hear you back." She said, "I heard you." He looked up at her. "I know you did," he said. "That's the thing. That first day, you walked in and you said hi, and you said your name, and you said you'd be back, and then you came back. Every day, and every day you talked to me like I was there. He stopped again. His jaw worked for a moment. You have no idea what that means to someone in that place. To have one person who acts like you're still in there. She thought about all the times in Afghanistan she had done exactly that. Talked to patients who couldn't answer. Not because she was certain they could hear, but because she believed they might, and that was enough. She thought about how many people had called that habit unnecessary, sentimental, a waste of time. She thought about what it had cost her in professional credibility over the years to insist on it anyway. She said, "You were always there, Ethan, every single day. I just had to look." He pressed his lips together and looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were bright, but his voice was steady. "When I get back," he said, "when I finish training, I want to do something. For patients like me, people who are in that place and nobody's looking for them." He paused. "There have to be more of them. People in there fighting and nobody's paying attention." She looked at him for a long moment. 24 years old, 8 weeks from becoming a Navy SEAL, 4 months of conscious paralysis and chemical suppression in between. And what he was thinking about was other people in that same darkness. She thought, like father, like son, in the best possible way. She said, "I think that's exactly what you should do." The formal findings of the internal hospital review were released 6 weeks after Ethan's extubation, and they were, as Kensington had predicted in the conference room on that first afternoon, not a record of coincidental errors. The review found documented evidence of systematic sedation mismanagement designed to suppress patient responsiveness before evaluations. It found evidence of deliberate EEG sensor repositioning to minimize the readability of cortical activity. It found that Dr. Victor Halpern had engaged in a pattern of conduct that constituted, in the review board's language, a profound and deliberate betrayal of the foundational obligations of medical practice. His medical license was suspended pending the federal investigation. The hospital administrator who had cooperated with Halpern in the documentation manipulation was terminated and referred to law enforcement. The hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Okafor, issued a public statement that was careful and measured and clearly written with legal counsel standing over her shoulder, but which between the lines said everything that needed to be said about what had happened in room 114. The statement described Olivia Bennett by name. It described her 11 days of observations, her documentation, her identification of the medication irregularities. It used the word courage in a sentence that was not the kind of sentence hospital administrations typically write about nurses who have been on staff for less than 2 weeks. Olivia read the statement in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon between patients. She read it twice. Then she folded the printout and put it in her bag and went back to work. 2 weeks after the public statement, the hospital's board of directors voted to create a new position, Patient Advocacy Liaison for Disorders of Consciousness. A dedicated clinical role reporting directly to the chief medical officer with authority to flag and independently review any patient case where concerns about diagnostic accuracy or treatment management had been raised and dismissed through normal channels. They offered the position to Olivia Bennett. She asked for 48 hours to think about it. She spent those 48 hours in the way she spent most things that mattered, thinking carefully, asking direct questions, and listening to what the answers revealed underneath the words. She asked Kensington what the position would actually allow her to do versus what the title suggested. She asked the hospital's patient safety director how much independent authority the role genuinely carried. She asked Admiral Carter, who had been deeply involved in the board's deliberations, whether the position was designed to create real change or to contain the story of what had happened by making it look like action. The Admiral looked at her and said, "I made sure it has teeth, real authority, Real reporting lines, real budget, not a title they hang on the wall so they can say they did something. He paused. But whether it works depends entirely on the person in the role. Institutions don't change because of org charts. They change because of the person. She said, "That sounds like a yes." "This was designed for you, and you know it," he said. She took the position. On the morning she signed the paperwork, she went to Ethan's room first. He was out of bed, actually standing, fully upright, with Garrett spotting him from 2 feet away, but not touching, and working through a set of balance exercises that 3 weeks ago would have been completely beyond him. He had regained enough strength to stand unassisted for 45 seconds before his legs gave. Garrett had told her quietly the day before that at his current rate of progress, Ethan would be walking independently within the next 2 weeks. He saw her come in and said, from his standing position, "You look like you've made a decision." She said, "They offered me a new job." He raised his eyebrows. "Here?" "New patient advocacy role, disorders of consciousness." She paused. "I'm taking it." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "You're going to find them, people like me." "That's the plan," she said. His 45 seconds were almost up. She could see the effort in his face, the legs beginning to shake microscopically with the load of holding him. He didn't sit down. He stood for another 5 seconds past the point where Garrett raised his hands to catch him, and then he sat, deliberately, under control, and looked at her with that absolute watchfulness that had never left his eyes. He said, "Good." Ethan Carter was discharged from Walter Reed's rehabilitation unit 9 weeks after extubation. He walked out of the building on his own 2 legs, with Admiral Carter on his left and Garrett on his right, and Kensington standing at the entrance with her arms crossed and an expression that, for the first time since Olivia had met her, had nothing clinical in it at all. Olivia stood at the entrance too. She had a 12-hour shift starting in 40 minutes and 3 new patients to review and the first formal procedures of her new role to begin that afternoon. She would not have missed this for any of it. Ethan stopped in front of her. He looked different in real clothes, standing at full height, moving under his own power. Still thinner than he should have been. Still moving with the careful deliberateness of a body that was rebuilding trust with itself. But upright, breathing, present in the world in the way that only people who have come close to leaving it permanently can be present, with an attentiveness, a sharpness, a refusal to take the ordinary moment for granted. He said, "I'm coming back." She said, "I know." "Not just to finish training," he said. "I'm coming back here to help build what you're building." He looked at her steadily. "Those people in the dark, they need someone who's been there, not just someone who watched." She thought about that. She thought about what he could bring to it. The particular knowledge of someone who had been on the inside of exactly the situation she was now tasked with identifying and preventing. The testimony of a body that had fought against invisibility with nothing but the strength of its own refusal to stop. She said, "When you're ready." 8 weeks, he said, give or take. He was not talking about visiting her new program. He was talking about SEAL training. He was going back. Of course he was going back. She would have been surprised by anything else. She said, 8 weeks. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and real and completely there. He walked to the car where his father was waiting, and Admiral Carter opened the door and put a hand briefly on his son's shoulder before they both got in, and the car pulled away from the curb and into the Maryland morning. Olivia stood at the entrance until the car was gone from sight. Then she went back inside. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. She sat down at the desk that was now hers, a real desk, in a real office, with a nameplate that had been there for 2 days and still surprised her slightly every time she saw it. And she opened the first file in the stack waiting for her. A 41-year-old woman, traumatic brain injury following a car accident, 3 hospitals in 2 states, 2 diagnoses of persistent vegetative state. One nurse who had flagged inconsistencies in the response documentation and been dismissed by 2 separate neurologists. The referral had been made to Olivia's office by the Patient Safety Board. The family had not been notified yet that someone was reviewing the case. She picked up her phone and called the family. The line rang twice and a woman answered, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who had spent months answering phones that brought only bad news, already bracing for whatever came next. Olivia said, "My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm the Patient Advocacy Liaison at Walter Reed Medical Center. I've been asked to review your mother's case, and I'd like to talk with you about what your care team has been observing." She paused. "I need to ask you, when you visit her, have you ever noticed her responding to your voice? Even something small, even something that seems like it might not mean anything." A silence on the line. Then the woman said, "Her hand. She moves her hand sometimes when I talk to her. The doctors say it's just a reflex, but it doesn't feel like a reflex to me." Olivia opened her notebook. She picked up her pen. "Tell me everything," she said. "Some people change the world from positions of power, with authority and resources and the institutional weight of rank behind them. And some people change it standing in the corner of a room that everyone else has already written off, watching a finger move, refusing to let that be the last word. Olivia Bennett was the second kind, and because she was, a son came home, a father did not bury him, a predator was exposed in a white coat, and somewhere in a hospital in a city you may never visit, a woman whose family had been told was gone heard her daughter's voice and moved her hand, and this time, someone was listening."